So, we've talked a little bit already about the UNESCO campaign and mentioned the survey of the last remaining sites in Egyptian Nubia. How did you come to be involved with that?
Well, this arose directly. Emery had said to the UNESCO committee that what they should do was to have surveys both in Egypt and in the Sudan of all the sites between the river level 30 and 60 that we were working between. And that for particular sites, e.g. like the Middle Kingdom fortresses and the late Nubian and Christian towns and Ibrahim and all that sort of thing, that they should give special concessions to countries or institutions offering. What the survey would do before would be to pick up sites in between and recommend them to the respective antiquities services, who would then decide on and pick the concessionaire, etc. Is that clear?
Yes, absolutely. And so, I understand you spent 2 seasons doing the survey.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you were actually doing?
Yes.
Was it a lot of walking, I think?
It is necessary. In the Sudan, if I may just say this for a moment, they got hold of a specialist, not in Egyptian or Nubian antiquities, but in river valley surveys, who was Bill Adams,
right,
from Kentucky, and he came in. He got his own aeroplane and he did his own mapping from the air and built up maps, and he'd done a most wonderful job. In Egyptian Nubia, Sudanese Nubia was practically virgin territory. Egyptian Nubia, of course, had been surveyed by the Reisner Firth survey in 7 to 11, by the Emery Kirwan survey when the old dam had been raised in 27 to 33. So that everything below RL 30, river level 30, had officially already been worked on. And even if it hadn't been worked on, it was under the reservoir, and Emery knew about this. What happened after the Reisner and Firth survey, and also after his own, is that dealers encouraged groups of ex-workmen to go down there and pillage all the remaining cemeteries and sites.
Really?
So the area that we were doing between river level 30 and 60, apart from certain surviving towns and forts and things, the cemeteries, at least when they were known of, had been emptied. So what we did was we had a boat, which in the first season was an old pumping station boat, and was metal, so that it was exceedingly hot. And for administrative reasons, because Emery was at Bouhen, we decided to do the survey from south to north up to the dam at Shalal. As you say, although it was all done in 1 year, it was done in 2 brief seasons, January to March 61 and September to November 61. And what we did, the idea was that we should move the boat from place to place as convenient, and then we would do all the sites in that restricted area and move on. Like all best laid plans, during the period from 33 onwards, all the great palm groves on which the Nubians lived, or nearly all of them, were under the reservoir. The tops of trees just sticking out, so that there were vast areas where we simply could not moor the boat.
Right.
So we had to moor it at various places at various distances. So not always, but sometimes we were left with 25 or 30 mile walks. And as I said, we had no transport. We did it all on foot.
Wow.
So that you appreciate that we did quite a lot of walking. And of course it got very hot at about 8 to 9 in the morning. It was cold when we went out, and you had to take a sweater with you. We used to start at 5 or 5:30, but by late in the morning it really was terribly, terribly hot. So what we did was, what our remit was to try and locate with the air photographic maps and the ground maps and the other aids that we had, sites which had not previously been explored of the dynastic era. Down to Cleopatra. I was not responsible for prehistoric or Christian, Roman and Christian did come into our remit, but I was not responsible for pre-dynastic or Islamic, nor was I responsible for rock drawings, etc., though when we saw them we did make a note of them. It was mainly dynastic Ptolemaic Roman Christian material that we were looking for, and we did it simply by marching in open order across the desert, and I used to usually come up behind because the men all came from Guft, so they belonged to the experienced excavation tradition. And when one of them made a signal to me that there was something he thought I should look at, I would go and do so. And of course my assistants, who were David O'Connor, who is now at New York, who was a brilliant archaeologist, really. I mean, he was absolutely excellent. And then I had a chap called Martin Minns, and in the second season Hazel came, my wife came too. So that is what we did, and we would get back to camp, to the boat at about 3, probably up as 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and then there were various mundane jobs like getting oneself clean and attending to any injuries or etc. And then we would have a meal, and then we were absolutely dead by that time. We used to sleep for an hour or an hour and a half in the afternoon. I had the unpleasant job of going and knocking everybody up at 6 o'clock, and we then started recording because everything just had to be recorded on the day, because otherwise you just would not have time to do it, and you'd begin to forget things and so on. So we did that, and then we had our evening meal, and then we went back to our recording by lamplight. I don't know whether you know what nimitti are, do you?
You better explain.
They're tiny, tiny flies. They don't bite, but there are millions and millions and millions of them. So they get between the lamp and the work, and most of the survey records are covered with a crust of dead nibitivodes. Anyway, so that's what we did.
So well, several questions strike me just as you were talking then. First of all, I can't shake the idea that this must have just been very physically demanding and not to say uncomfortable as well. I mean, you must have had to have been very fit just to do all of this walking. Presumably you needed to take equipment with you when you were walking out into the desert. And you mentioned that, you know, you would treat any injuries that you had when you got back. I mean, what can you sort of explain?
Well, all I mean by that is, you see, the men, for instance, I mean, I tried to bully them into wearing footwear, but they absolutely wouldn't, because it would have ruined their sandals, you see, and they only had one pair of sandals each. And, so that, you know, you got occasional cuts and things. We did once get a bad scorpion bite, a chap got bitten in the foot, but we had taken serums and so on. Mercifully, that only happened once. So there were lots of scorpions about, and eventually, I mean, Emery had legislated for putting the men in tents, but eventually I had to move them out of the tents because they were just getting so many scorpions in them, and I had to move them into the bowels of the boat, which anyway, well, I mean, we were three fit young men, and the Egyptian inspectors we had with us were young men too, and you know, but it varied from day to day a bit. I mean, sometimes, for instance, for one period of nearly 2 weeks, we were moored outside Abu Simbel. This was because the tug had broken down. Right. But also there was a lot to do in the Bologna Abu Simbel area, and during that period we were not so much walking as actually working on the sites. But at other times and in other places we did go very long walks, and then sometimes you know, we had to go back over it because there was a site we needed to examine.
Did you have all of your supplies of food with you for the duration? Right. Yeah. So you never had any problems with having to acquire food locally? Well,
we did, but I mean, well, technically that was my fault. I took Molly Emery's advice, she was immensely experienced on the quantities that we'd need, but of course she was thinking in terms of her own camp and being able to do a certain amount of shopping in Wadi Halfa, etc., whereas there turned out to be absolutely nothing. Right. In Egyptian Nubia. The people themselves were having great difficulty. Those who remained, they were being moved at the time. Right. In feeding themselves, so that the last week or two of the first season we were down to rice and very little else, but we managed. I mean, we never starved, and I was tried to see there was a good meal and we had a good cook, but it did get a bit. The second season, Hazel came with us, and that was better.
Did you ever suffer any illnesses, or did any of your staff?
Yes, alas, David O'Connor in the first season, after working immensely hard, went down with a fever, which eventually I managed to. We had no doctor with us. And there's a doctor at Nubia, which is about halfway between Aswan and Wadi Halfa, and that was all. But anyway, I saw that it was jaundice, and fortunately we were getting towards the end of the work, and when we got to Nubia that was confirmed, so I decided to pack up get him home as soon as possible, and we packed up the expedition, and we'd already done about 2 months, and it was enough.
Yes, sure.